For 11 years, a young woman from rural Korea walked into leper colonies that everyone else walked away from, and she did it barefoot on purpose, so the dying could hear her coming. Her name was Soo-ja. She was born in 1895 in a small farming village outside Daegu, the third daughter of a schoolteacher who owned more books than most men in the province. She died in 1956 in a tuberculosis ward in Busan, having never owned a house, never accumulated savings, and never once, by every account from those who knew her, expressed regret about any of it. By the time she was 32, she had planted 14 house churches across the Korean peninsula. She had personally led more than 3,000 people to faith. The Japanese colonial government had put her name on a surveillance list. And a man who claimed to speak for God had taken everything she built and dismantled it, piece by piece, in the name of spiritual authority. She spent the last decade of her life in near total obscurity. She died having written one sentence in the margin of her worn-out Bible, next to the story of the woman who lost her coin and searched the whole house until she found it. This is why. That's it. No explanation, just, this is why. The question isn't whether you would do what Soo-ja did. The question is whether you understand what she paid to do it, and whether the church that watched it happen has ever truly reckoned with what it lost. She was born into a Korea that was already disappearing. The year was 1895, 2 years before the Joseon dynasty formally collapsed under Japanese pressure, and the world Soo-ja entered was one caught between two eras, neither fully the old Korea nor yet anything new. Her father, a man named Han Byung-cheol, was what people called a modern man in the way that phrase is used about people who are slightly ahead of the collapse they're living through. He had attended a mission school in Daegu as a young man. He could read English well enough to argue with it. He kept a small Bible on the same shelf as his Confucian texts, as if to see which one would outlast the other. Her mother was quieter about everything, which people mistook for softness. She was not soft. She simply expressed her convictions through what she did rather than what she said. Rising above the household, preparing, working through until the children were fed and the lamps were lit, and then, only then, resting. Soo-ja would inherit this pattern so completely that people who worked alongside her years later said it's almost eerie. She moved through the world as if rest were a thing you earned at the end, not something you took at the beginning. She was 7 years old when she first saw a leper. It was on a road outside of Daegu, at a turn where a creek crossed beneath a stone bridge. The man was sitting at the edge of the road with his feet in the water, and Soo-ja was walking with her older sister, and her sister grabbed her arm and pulled her to the other side of the road and told her not to look. She looked anyway. The man had no expression on his face that she could read. He wasn't crying, he wasn't begging. He was just sitting with his feet in the water and watching the road like he was waiting for something that might never come. She thought about him for weeks, not with horror, which is what her sister expected, with something she couldn't name at 7 and would spend the rest of her life trying to name, a feeling like a question lodged in the chest, the kind you can't answer but also can't put down. Her father noticed her quietness that season. He didn't push, he waited, and one evening, when she finally told him about the man at the bridge, he sat with her for a long time before he said anything. Then he told her the story of the 10 lepers in the Gospel of Luke, not the whole story, just the ending, where one came back to say thank you and 9 didn't, and how Jesus had asked, "Were there not 10 cleansed? Where are the 9? That question, her father said, was not rhetorical. Soo-ja was 9 when she understood what he meant. She was 12 when she decided what to do about it. The mission school in Daegu was run by American Presbyterian missionaries, and it was one of the few places in early 20th century Korea where a girl from a poor to middling family could receive something approximating a real education. Han Byung-cheol sent all 3 of his daughters there, which was unusual enough in 1907 that the neighbors talked about it. He didn't care what the neighbors thought. He cared what his daughters would know when the world around them finished whatever convulsion it was going through. Soo-ja was not the most gifted student in her class. She was not the quickest reader or the best at memorization. But she had something that her teachers noticed and struggled to articulate in their reports home. She paid attention to the right things. When a lesson moved too fast, she wrote down the questions she still had, instead of pretending she'd understood. When another student was crying at lunch, she sat down beside her without asking whether it was appropriate. When the mission school held its first ever prayer meeting for Korean girls, Soo-ja was not only there, she was the one who stayed after everyone else had gone home, and the American missionary woman, a tall woman from Ohio named Mrs. Edna Moore, found her still on her knees an hour later and had to gently remind her that supper existed. Mrs. Moore would later write in a letter to her home church, "There is a girl here who prays as if she is having a conversation with someone who is actually in the room." What was happening inside that prayer, Soo-ja never fully explained. She wasn't a person who explained her inner life in large, dramatic terms. But there are two things her close friends reported from those years. First, that somewhere around the age of 14, she became convinced that she was being called specifically toward people that the church had decided, quietly, practically, without ever saying so directly, to leave alone. Second, that she was not afraid of this calling. She was terrified of failing it. Those are different things. People sometimes confuse them. The year she turned 19, the Japanese colonial government formally consolidated its hold over Korea, and the country that Soo-ja had grown up in, fragile, disputed, in between, ceased to exist as a legal entity. This mattered to her faith in a way she didn't expect and couldn't fully articulate. She wrote in her journal, a small notebook she kept, mostly in Korean, occasionally in English when she was working through something and wanted the distance of a second language. She wrote, "If the kingdom I belong to is not of this world, then no government can take it. But if I act as if this world's kingdoms are the ones that matter, then I have already lost something more important than my country." She was 19. She had never preached a sermon. She was doing needlework to help her family survive, because the school had closed the year before, under administrative pressure, and her father had lost his teaching position. She kept going to the mission compound to pray. Mrs. Moore was still there, grayer now, still writing letters home. She would make tea, and they would sit together, and Soo-ja would tell her about the lepers outside of town. Not the one at the bridge anymore, but a whole settlement, a cluster of families living in the hills east of Daegu, beyond the tree line where the main road ended, in houses built from whatever the healthy world had thrown away. Mrs. Moore asked if she wanted to go. "I've already been," Soo-ja said. "Alone, yes. How many times?" "Every Thursday for the past 3 months." Mrs. Moore put her teacup down. She looked at this 19-year-old girl sitting across from her, calm, a little thin from the needlework diet, wearing a jacket that had been mended so many times the original color was only visible in the middle of the back, and she said, "Soo-ja, why didn't you tell me?" Soo-ja thought about it for a moment. "Because I wasn't sure you would let me go." What she found in that settlement was what no one had wanted to see. 43 people, 12 children, 3 elderly men who had been there so long that no one living in the village below could remember a time when they hadn't been there. The community was led, loosely, by a man in his 50s who had been a blacksmith before the disease took his hands. His name, the name he gave her, the name he used with her from that first Thursday, when she walked up the path wearing her good shoes and carrying a cloth bag with rice and a small bottle of medicine she'd bought with money she'd saved from 6 weeks of needlework, was simply Old Master Kwan. He looked at her on that first visit the way someone looks at a person who has walked into the wrong room but somehow managed to make it seem like they belonged there. "You're not afraid," he said. It wasn't a compliment, it was an observation. Slightly suspicious. "I am afraid," she said. "But not of you." He thought about that. "Then of what?" "Of leaving," she said. She stayed for 4 hours that first Thursday. She came back the following week, and the week after. She brought rice when she had it, medicine when she could find it, and on the weeks when she had neither, she brought herself and her Bible and her willingness to sit with people who had been left to die in a manner clean enough to pretend they hadn't been left. Within 3 months, 12 people in that settlement had asked her to pray with them. Within 6 months, there was something that could only be called a church. No building, no denomination, no formal anything. Just 43 people and one 20-year-old woman gathering on Thursday afternoons to sing and pray, and read aloud from a Bible that was, by that point, held together with strips of cloth cut from Soo-ja's old school jacket. Word got out. It always does, with things like this. The first to come were the curious, a young Korean pastor from a church in Daegu who had heard rumors and wanted to see for himself. He came once, stood at the edge of the gathering, and left without speaking to anyone. 3 weeks later, he came back with 2 other men. This time he stayed for the whole afternoon. He wept during the singing, which surprised him enough that he had to turn away. He told Soo-ja afterward that he had been preaching for 7 years and had never felt in a church meeting what he felt in this hillside gathering of lepers and a 20-year-old woman with a falling-apart Bible. She told him she wasn't doing anything. She was just showing up. He said, that's the thing no one else was willing to do. By the time Soo-ja was 24, she had 3 leper settlements under her informal care. The original one east of Daegu, one further north near Andong, and a third that had formed almost spontaneously when families from 2 other settlements heard about what she was doing and walked 2 days to find her. She had no title, no official organization, no salary. She had also begun doing something that made the established mission churches in the region deeply uncomfortable. She had started training the people in her settlements to lead their own gatherings. Not men ordained by denominations, not seminary graduates, lepers, former blacksmiths, farmers whose hands didn't work anymore, elderly women who had never been allowed to speak in a church in their lives. She sat with them one at a time, working through scripture, working through what it meant to teach, working through the basics of how to lead a prayer meeting. And then she stepped back and let them do it, showing up as a participant rather than a leader, watching to see where they needed help, offering it quietly and without drawing attention to herself. The pastor from Daegu, whose name was Lee Chun-bai, came to one of these gatherings and watched a woman with leprosy, a woman who had lost 3 fingers on her left hand, stand up and explain the parable of the prodigal son to 38 people, and do it better than he had ever done it. From his own pulpit, he went home and sat with that for a long time. Then he sent a letter to the regional mission board recommending that Soo-ja be given formal support and recognition for what she was doing. The board wrote back and said they would pray about it. They prayed about it for 4 years. In the winter of 1924, Soo-ja walked into a meeting she had not been invited to. This was not uncharacteristic of her. She was, by this point, 29 years old and had learned that waiting for permission was a way of letting urgency die. If something needed to happen, you found the room where the decision was being made, and you put yourself in it. And you made the case clearly and without apology. And then you waited to see what kind of people you were dealing with. The meeting was at the Regional Mission Board's office in Daegu, a building she had been in 3 times before, always at someone else's invitation, always as the subject of a conversation rather than a participant in it. This time she walked in while the board was still gathered and set her notebook on the table and asked if she could have 10 minutes. There were 6 men in the room. 5 were Korean pastors. One was an American missionary named Dr. Franklin Graves, who had been in Korea for 20 years and had the permanent squint of a man who had spent 2 decades trying to understand something very complicated. They gave her 10 minutes. She used 11. She told them about the settlements. She told them, with numbers, because she had kept careful records in those small notebooks, that in the previous 3 years, she had documented 847 individuals in leper communities who had made professions of faith. She told them that 14 of those individuals were now leading regular worship gatherings of their own. She told them that 3 settlements had begun tithing, not money, which most of them didn't have, but labor, hours contributed to the care of other sick members of their community, formalized and tracked, based on the principle in Acts 2 that everyone contributed according to what they had. She told them she needed help, not oversight, not a title. Help. Specifically, a small budget for medicine and basic food supplies, and one other person willing to do what she was doing. Dr. Graves asked her one question when she was done. He said, "Miss Han, what do you do when you're afraid?" She looked at him. "I go anyway," she said. "Being afraid doesn't change what needs to be done. It just means I go knowing I can't do it alone." The board voted 3-3. Dr. Graves cast the tie-breaking vote in her favor. She walked out with a budget equivalent to $8 a month, and a promise that they would assign someone to help her within the year. They assigned her a 22-year-old theology student named Park Do-hyun, who had never been to a leper settlement and was visibly terrified on the walk up the hill his first Thursday. She walked beside him and didn't say anything until they were almost at the top, and then she said, "Walk slower. They'll hear your shoes and know you're coming. It helps." He said, "Why does that matter?" she said. "Because it means you're not sneaking up on them. It means you're not ashamed to be known." Park Do-hyun stayed for 9 years. The revival, when it came, did not look like what anyone expected. It came in the spring of 1928, and it came not with a famous preacher or a special event, or any of the apparatus that revivals are usually attached to. It came through the women. Specifically, it came through a gathering that Soo-ja had organized at the largest of the leper settlements, by now home to more than 90 people. On a Saturday afternoon in March, she had asked the women from 4 different settlements to gather together for a day of prayer and scripture. Not a service, not a program, just women from communities that lived in isolation coming together in one place to pray for each other. 41 women came. What happened that afternoon is recorded in 3 separate sources. Soo-ja's own journal, a letter Park Do-hyun wrote to a friend in Seoul, and a brief entry in the Regional Mission Board's records, where it appears under the heading Unusual Spiritual Activity, Daegu Region, March 1928. All 3 accounts say the same thing in different words. That something broke open that afternoon that no one could explain and no one had planned for. That women who had been silent for years began praying aloud for the first time. That the prayers turned into confession, and the confession turned into weeping, and the weeping turned into something that everyone present described as the nearness of God, not metaphorically, but as a physical, unmistakable, overwhelming presence in the room. It lasted 7 hours. By the time it ended, 3 women who had come as skeptics had become believers. 2 women had confessed to estrangements with family members they hadn't spoken to in years and made plans to write letters that week. One elderly woman who had not left her house in 4 months because she was convinced her illness had made her unlovable, stood up in front of 40 other women and said, "God sees me. I know that now. I know it like I know my own name." The fire did not stay contained. Within 2 months, it had spread to the surrounding churches in Daegu. Not through official channels, not through any board's announcement, but through the women themselves, who went home and told their husbands and their sons and their pastors what had happened on that Saturday afternoon. And the pastors came to see for themselves, and they could not explain what they found. And some of them found it threatening, and some of them found it humbling, and a few of them found it the most real thing they had encountered in their ordained lives. 14 new house churches started in Daegu and the surrounding area in the 18 months following that March afternoon. Many of them were led by people who had never been to seminary. The mission board, catching up to what was already happening, held an emergency meeting and wrote 3 different position papers on the theological legitimacy of lay leadership, all of which arrived after the fact. Soo-ja, meanwhile, had moved north. She had heard about a community in the hills outside of Andong, where 300 lepers were living in conditions that made the Daegu settlements look comfortable, and she had spent 6 months trying to find someone to go. When she couldn't find anyone, she went herself. She was 33 years old. She had an $8 monthly stipend, and the worn Bible held together with cloth strips, now supplemented by a newer one she'd received as a gift. Though she kept the old one too, because she could not bring herself to leave behind a thing that had been through everything with her. What she found in Andong was worse than she'd heard. She stayed for 2 years. In that time, she established a nursing rotation staffed by women from the community itself. People who were sick but not incapacitated, trained to care for those who were worse off. She partnered with a Japanese doctor who had been working in the region, and who was, by his own admission, bewildered and somewhat moved by her presence there. She organized the community's limited resources with the same quiet precision she had learned. Watching her mother move through a household, not dramatically, but systematically, accounting for what they had and allocating it in a way that left no one with nothing. And she started, Again, the Thursday gatherings. They grew faster in Andong than they had in Daegu, which surprised her. She wrote about it in her journal. I think because the people here have been so utterly abandoned that any presence feels like a miracle. Lord, help me to be worthy of what they are receiving me as. I know I am not what they think I am. I know you are. Help the difference not to destroy what you are doing here. That was 1930. Korea was 12 years into Japanese colonial rule. The pressure on Korean churches was increasing. Services monitored, scripture reading scrutinized, any gathering of Koreans regarded with official suspicion. The leper settlements were, paradoxically, somewhat protected by the very stigma that isolated them. The authorities weren't eager to go up the hill and check on the lepers. Soo-ja was aware of this. She used it. She was not naive about what she was doing. She was not, despite what her later critics would claim, simply a well-meaning woman fumbling forward on instinct. She was methodical. She thought carefully about what she was doing and why. She had a theology of suffering that she had worked out over 15 years of direct contact with people in extreme pain. And it was not the theology that says suffering is a gift from God. It was the theology that says suffering is real, that it costs something real, and that the proper response to it is to go toward it rather than away from it. Because going toward it is the only way to be in the place where the healing happens. She believed God healed people. She had seen it. Not constantly, not on demand, but she had seen it. She did not make it the center of her theology, because she had also sat with people who prayed for healing and did not receive it, and she had no interest in a faith that disappeared when the miracle didn't come. She believed God was present. That was the center. That God was present in the places everyone else had decided God probably wasn't. The hill outside of Daegu, the settlement in Andong, the room where the dying woman was convinced she was too broken to be loved. That was what she preached. Not with those words, necessarily, but that was what she preached. The man's name was Elder Kwan Hyoksin. He arrived in Andong in 1932, sent by a church organization in Seoul that had heard about what was happening in the settlements. The house churches, the lay leaders, the revival that had started with 41 women on a Saturday afternoon, and had decided that what was happening needed to be organized. He was 51 years old. He had been a church elder for 20 years. He was, by several accounts, a man of genuine faith and considerable spiritual ego, which is a more common combination than people like to admit. He met with Soo-ja for 3 hours on his first day in Andong. He was polite. He was interested. He asked good questions. He seemed, she later wrote, to understand what she was doing and why it mattered. At the end of the meeting he said, "Sister Han, you have done remarkable work here. The church in Seoul is grateful. We would like to formalize what you've built. Give it proper structure, proper oversight, proper accountability." She said, "What would that look like?" He said, "We would assign ordained elders to each of the settlement churches. The house church meetings would continue, but under proper pastoral authority." She said, "The leaders of those meetings are already under pastoral authority. They have been meeting with Pastor Lee in Daegu for years and with the Missionary Board." He said, "I mean Korean pastoral authority, proper Korean church authority." She understood what he meant. She was not Korean pastoral authority, because she was not ordained, because she was a woman, because the Korean church in 1932 did not ordain women and had no plans to, she said. "And what happens to the people who are currently leading those gatherings?" He paused. "They would continue to participate, in an appropriate capacity." "That's not an answer," she said. It was the only time in the meeting that her voice changed. He left Andong a week later. He sent a letter to the mission board in Daegu and to the church organization in Seoul. The letter described the leper settlement ministries as spiritually significant but structurally irregular, and recommended a period of reorganization and proper oversight to ensure theological accountability and doctrinal stability. The mission board, which had voted 3-3 on giving her $8 a month 4 years earlier, voted this time without a tiebreaker. They sent Elder Kwan back to Andong with formal authority. Over the following 14 months, he restructured every house church she had built. He replaced the lay leaders, the former blacksmith, the three-fingered woman who had explained the prodigal son, the elderly woman who now led weekly prayer for 22 others, with ordained men from the city. Some of the ordained men were good. Some of them lasted 3 months before the difficulty of the work drove them back to more comfortable postings. All of them arrived with authority that the communities they entered had not asked for, and did not, in most cases, particularly want. Attendance at the Thursday gatherings dropped by 40% in the first 6 months. Park Do-hyun, Soo-ja's 9-year companion, resigned from his position in protest and wrote a letter to the board saying so. The board noted his resignation and assigned a replacement. Soo-ja did not resign. She did not protest. She asked Elder Kwon for a meeting, was given one, made her case clearly. Attendance numbers, community feedback, the specific names of leaders who had been removed and what they had built, and was told that the decision had been made at a level above her and above him, and that the restructuring would continue. She walked out of that meeting and stood in the street outside the building for a long time. Then she walked up the hill to the settlement. Old Master Kwon, the blacksmith, the first man who had ever watched her walk up a path and decided to see if she would come back, was sitting in the sun outside his door. He was older now. His hands were worse. He had been one of the first leaders removed from his position. He looked at her face and said, "They took it away. They reorganized it," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "It's the same thing when you're the one it's being done to." She sat down beside him. "What do we do?" she said. She asked him not rhetorically. She genuinely wanted to know what he thought. He said, "We do what we were doing before you came. We survive. We pray. We wait for God to send someone who isn't afraid." She said, "I'm not leaving." He said, "I know. I meant after you." She stayed in the settlements for another 11 years. She did not lead the Thursday gatherings anymore. Those had official leadership now. She came as a participant. She sat in the back. She prayed. Occasionally, one of the ordained leaders would ask her a question about the history of the community, and she would answer it. And then she would sit back down. She kept the nursing rotation running. That had not been reorganized, because it was considered support work rather than ministry. And Elder Kwon was not interested in organizing support work. She kept showing up on her own time to teach women in the communities how to care for each other, how to document illness progression, how to identify the early signs of secondary infections. She partnered with 2 Japanese doctors who were, themselves, doing work that the official medical establishment didn't pay much attention to, and together they developed a set of practices for wound care in leper communities that would later be incorporated into formal medical guidelines. She did all of this without a title, without a salary beyond the $8 monthly stipend, without recognition. She also quietly kept training people, not publicly, not in the official gatherings. One at a time, on Tuesday afternoons when no one was holding a meeting, she sat with whoever came and worked through scripture with them and helped them think through how to lead, how to pray, how to teach. She didn't call it a training program. She called it studying together. Elder Kwon eventually heard about this. He sent a letter asking her to stop, on the grounds that it duplicated the official training being offered by the ordained leaders. She wrote back and said she would be happy to stop if the official training was reaching the same people in the same way. She listed, by name, 17 individuals who had asked to study with her and who were not attending the official training, with brief explanations of why. Too far, too intimidating, couldn't leave sick family members for the length of time required, had been told once by an ordained leader that questions were not appropriate during teaching time and had not returned. He did not write back. She kept meeting on Tuesday afternoons. In 1943, the Japanese colonial government began systematically dismantling Korean Christian organizations. Churches were forced to merge. Leaders were arrested. The pressure that had been building for 12 years became direct and unavoidable. Soo-ja was 48 years old. She had been in the settlements for almost 20 years. She was, by this point, showing early signs of tuberculosis. Not from leprosy, which she had never contracted, but from years of living in cold, damp conditions and neglecting her own health in the systematic way that people do when they are convinced that everyone else's needs are more urgent than their own. The Japanese authorities came to the Andong settlement in October of 1943. They came with a list, Specifically, they were looking for evidence of illegal assembly and anti-colonial religious activity. The Thursday gatherings had been reported. Soo-ja was not there when they arrived. She was 2 hills over at the smaller settlement, teaching a Tuesday afternoon scripture session. By the time she got back, the authorities had left with 2 people. The current ordained leader of the Thursday gathering, a young pastor named Im-seok-jin, who had been there for 8 months and was, by all accounts, a genuinely good man who was also genuinely terrified, and an elderly woman named Park Bok-soon, who had been at every Thursday gathering since 1928 and who had told the authorities, when they asked her why she kept coming to these meetings, "Because God is here and I am not afraid of you." Park Bok-soon was released after 2 days. She was too old and too sick to be useful as a symbol, and the authorities were looking for symbols. Im-seok-jin was held for 3 weeks. He was not tortured, but he was questioned extensively about the organizational structure of the house churches. Who ran them, who funded them, what the connection was to foreign mission organizations. He answered everything honestly, because he was honest, and because there was nothing to hide. When he came back to Andong, he sat with Soo-ja for a long time before he said anything. Then he said, "They asked me who started this. I told them the truth, I told them it was you." She nodded. He said, "They said they already knew that. They said they had your name." She nodded again. "Are you afraid?" he asked. She thought about it honestly, which was the only way she knew how to think about things. "Not of them," she said. She was arrested in December of 1943 and held for 11 days. She was questioned about the house churches, about the mission board connection, about whether she had been passing information to foreign organizations. She answered everything, honestly, because she was honest, and because there was nothing to hide. She was released on December 22nd, 2 days before Christmas, without explanation. The official record shows no charge was filed. She walked back up the hill to the settlement in the snow. Old Master Kwan had died the previous year, at 73. His hands had given out entirely in his last months, and Soo-ja had spent those months doing what she could. Sitting with him, reading to him, holding his ruined hands between hers and praying for him while he slept. She stood at the place where his house had been. It had been given to a younger family, and she stood there for a while in the snow. Then she walked to Park Bok-soon's house and knocked on the door. The old woman opened it and looked at her and said, "You're back." "I'm back," Soo-ja said. "Come in," Park Bok-soon said. "I'll make tea." Korea was liberated in 1945. The leper settlements, which had survived the colonial years in the way that truly marginal communities survive, by being beneath official notice until they weren't, emerged from the occupation thinner, older, and in many cases, more spiritually dense than when they'd gone in. The years of pressure had not extinguished what Soo-ja had built. They had in some ways concentrated it. She was 50 years old in 1945. The tuberculosis had progressed. She was thinner than she had been. She coughed in a way that people noticed, and then looked away from, because looking at it directly felt like acknowledging something no one was ready to acknowledge. She kept working. The post-liberation period brought its own chaos, the division of the peninsula, the political upheaval, the scramble of church organizations to re-establish themselves in the new landscape. The mission board reorganized. The Seoul Church Organization sent new representatives. Elder Kwan Hyuk-sin had died in 1944. His successors came with different names and largely similar instincts. The house churches that had survived were, in most cases, reabsorbed into formal denominational structures. The women who led them, the ones Soo-ja had trained on Tuesday afternoons for 20 years, were acknowledged warmly and given no official role. Soo-ja watched this happen from Busan, where she had moved in 1948 when her health made it impossible to continue living in the settlements. She lived in a small room near the port, attended a church she found by walking in one Sunday morning and staying because the singing was good, and spent her mornings at the tuberculosis ward at the local hospital. She had not been asked to work there. She had simply started showing up, the way she had always simply started showing up. And within 3 months, the nurses knew her by name, and the patients knew which days she came, and she had become, in the understated and undeclared way that she seemed to become things, essential. She visited patients no one else visited. She sat with the dying, not flinching, not performing comfort, just being present in the way she had learned on the hill outside Daegu. When she was 19 years old with a question lodged in her chest, she wrote no memoir. She gave no final interviews. She didn't leave behind an organized archive of her work. The notebooks were scattered, many lost, a few preserved by people who had kept them without knowing exactly why. She died on April 3, 1956, in the tuberculosis ward where she had spent her mornings for 8 years. She was 61 years old. The diagnosis had been made 11 years earlier. She had not stopped working. Im Seok-jin, the young pastor who had been arrested in 1943 and released and had stayed in Andong until 1950, came to her funeral. Park Bok-soon, now in her 80s, was there. A handful of women from the Daegu settlements made the journey. Several nurses from the hospital. A doctor who had never worked in a leper settlement but who had been converted, quietly and permanently, by watching her work. No church organization sent a representative. The pastor who officiated read from Luke, the parable of the woman who lost her coin, who swept the whole house, who searched until she found it. Someone who had known her well. It is not recorded who had brought her Bible. The worn one, the old one, held together with cloth strips. It was placed on the coffin during the service. On the inside back cover, in her handwriting, were the words she had written years ago, next to the parable. This is why. The fire she started did not die with her. The lay leaders she trained on Tuesday afternoons for 20 years. The people no official program had reached. The ones who had been told once that questions weren't appropriate. Those women went on. They led gatherings in their own communities. They trained their daughters. Some of their daughters became the first wave of women formally recognized as ministers in Korean Protestant denominations. Decades later, after long fights in church courts and denominational assemblies and committee meetings that moved slowly but eventually moved, the nursing practices she and the Japanese doctors had developed in the Andong settlements were adopted by the Korean Ministry of Health in 1962. The revival that had started on a Saturday afternoon in March 1928. 41 women in a leper settlement, 7 hours, the nearness of God descending on a community that the rest of the church had mostly agreed not to think too hard about. That revival became one of the documented sources of the Korean church renewal movements of the 1950s and 60s, which became one of the great untold stories of 20th century Christianity, which became the foundation for a Korean church that today sends more missionaries per capita than any country on earth. It all started with a woman who walked up a hill barefoot so the dying could hear her coming, who sat with people no one else would sit with, who built something extraordinary and then watched it be taken from her and kept building anyway, who died in a hospital ward on a Tuesday morning having said everything she needed to say in 2 words in the margin of an old Bible. This is why.